Welcome to the Melbourne Writers Festival. We respectfully acknowledge that tonight we're meeting on the traditional lands of Kulin Nation, in particular the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people. We pay respect to their elders and the elders of all communities and cultures across Victoria, and a particularly warm welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the audience tonight. Also, a very warm thanks to the Wheeler Centre, which is generously supporting this session, Power, Abuse and Facing Facts. You might be wondering who else is coming to sit with me up here, aside from the most powerful man in the Me Too movement, Ronan Farrow. I can assure you this other chair is not for Harvey Weinstein, nor is it for Woody Allen. This quite famous empty chair has been placed here by PEN International, which works on behalf of writers who are silenced for carrying out the peaceful practice of their profession. Many writers and journalists knowingly defy censorship and scorn prohibitions for causes that are beyond their own personal advantage. Clearly, truth-telling is a dangerous business. Each year, PEN campaigns for many writers around the world who are unjustly harassed, imprisoned, tortured and murdered with impunity in order to suppress the injustices that their writing brings to light. So it is fitting that here in Australia, where we write without fear of persecution, we think of our fellow writers who do not share the fundamental human right of freedom of expression. We see more and more that legal processes are chilling free speech. Recent Australian government legislation included in anti-terrorism protections has the potential to threaten the freedom of our press to legitimately and without fear protest and voice concerns about government policy and national action. And so the empty chair on stage today is for Narges Mohammadi. Mohammadi is an independent journalist and human rights campaigner representing political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in legal proceedings. She also campaigns against the death penalty in Iran. In 2016, she was sentenced to 16 years imprisonment, 5 years in prison for meeting and conspiring against the Islamic Republic, 1 year for spreading propaganda against the system, and 10 years for her work advocating against the death penalty. Mohammadi explains why and how she keeps fighting. People with common sense and those lusting for power think that prisons are places where inmates go through pain and suffering to repent and return to society. They don't realise that when pain is inflicted by taking away the freedom of an idealist, it makes her even more determined. Freedom of expression is not a crime, it is a human right. Tonight's discussion will also focus on human rights and the abuse of power, and what Ronan Farrow calls this widening delta between the powerful and the powerless, which manifests in the form of the Me Too movement. This is a dark and difficult topic which may be triggering and traumatic for many of you in the room here. Please remember that if you experience any distress, you can call 1-800-RESPECT. This moment gets called a reckoning, but we just started telling the truth. This tweet was written by the extremely humble man who's about to take the stage. Ronan Farrow is an investigative journalist who writes for The New Yorker, which published his culture-shifting series of stories on sexual assault and harassment. He also makes documentaries for HBO. He's been an anchor and reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, and his writing has appeared in publications including The Wall Street Journal and The Washington Post. Ronan is also a former State Department official who worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan and reported to the Secretary of State as the United States senior official reporting on youth uprisings. He's the author of War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy and the Decline of the American Influence, and winner of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, a 2018 George Polk Award, and has been nominated for the National Magazine Award, among many other commendations. Named one of Time's 100 most influential people of 2018, his speeches have been selected among NPR's greatest commencement speeches ever, and Huffington Post's top 10 speeches of the year. Would you please give a warm welcome to the stage to Ronan Farrow.
Hello, Melbourne! Am I pronouncing that right? Yes. Americans don't know how to say it. Doesn't matter how many times you tell us, we don't know. I'm actually Australian, if you can believe that. My grandfather is from here, and I may want to escape to here eventually. Although, you know what, glass houses, you guys can't keep a prime minister for 5 minutes, so that's 2 countries in complete chaos that I'm from. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time to come out and have this conversation. It's an important one. Thank you to Marique and everyone with the festival, to the Wheeler Center, to the National Gallery of Victoria, and of course to Tracey Spicer, who has hidden from me here somewhere, but will be back out, and who is someone I admire a lot personally. I've been so inspired by the work of Tracey and so many others like her in countries all around the world. People, journalists in particular, who stood up and said enough, and who took the movement of investigative reporting in the States as a call to arms, not as the end of a story. It's in no small part due to that movement of reporters around the world that we've seen so much progress. These are people who continue to bang their heads against the wall and who will not stop in the face of a lot of obstacles. That's the reason why we're seeing these hard truths dragged into the spotlight, sometimes kicking and screaming. That's why we're hearing long marginalized voices now in a way that we haven't for years, including survivors of sexual violence. We are grappling all over the world in our cultures with our collective failure to create respect and dignity and spaces that treat men and women equally. And we're learning a lot about how powerful men who did despicable things, sometimes violent things, were protected for so long. I know that hearing about people like they're introduced at conferences, the way Tracey introduced me in that incredibly gracious intro that you just heard, presents a neat, convenient version of the story. The way the media talks about us after the fact makes it all seem like it was kind of fancy from the beginning, like it was all neat and wrapped up with a ribbon. I'm still tackling tough stories, and I still get a lot of shit. Can I say that here? Were you a crowd where I can say that? On a lot of them. So I'm grateful every single time I get a kind introduction or an award or any shred of support, and that's why I'm so grateful you're all here tonight. But I did want to take a moment to talk about what it's like when you're trying to do work you believe in before that moment of impact, before people process it and turn it into a neat, convenient story. I've talked a little in the past about some of the challenges that I've faced reporting my stories on sexual violence, how the systems that conspired to keep the victims of that violence silent for so long, and the powerful men that I mentioned earlier, came crashing down on me too, and on many other reporters who tried to unveil these truths, and how so many people that I trusted and considered friends turned on me, and powerful forces in the American media became instruments of oppression and silence. I get asked about that story a lot, and fair enough, there are vast systems at work that I think need to be exposed in terms of how the media can become complicit in keeping these stories silent. But that's actually not the facet of this that I want to focus on tonight. I want to talk about something much simpler, something that I'm guessing each and every one of you has gone through a version of, whether you are a doctor or a foreman or a teacher or a professor or a miner. In life, we face moments where it seems impossible to know what the right choice is. And that's exactly where I was 1 year ago today. I was not, at that point, a celebrated journalist when I set about trying to break these things. I was just a guy doing my job at a time when not a lot of people believed in me, to be completely honest. I don't say that for any sympathy. I'd had an incredible career with lots of opportunities. I'd done work that I was proud of, and I don't take that for granted. But the reality is my career was also kind of on the rocks. I had a show that was canceled, people weren't expecting great things from me, and as a result of tackling this story as doggedly as I did and not stopping, even what I had at that time started to slip away from me. There was a point a year ago when I did not have the institutional support of my television network, my contract was ending, and after I refused to drop the Weinstein story, I did not have a new contract. My book publisher dropped me, refusing to look at a single page of a manuscript I'd labored on for years. I found out that there was another news outlet racing to beat me on the Weinstein story, and I knew I was falling behind. I didn't know if I would ever be able to support that story, if I would ever find a place that would actually run it. And if I did find a way to run it, I didn't know if anyone would care. Because I had spent a year in rooms with executives telling me this was not a story. Because this was before all of these extraordinary months of people like Tracey taking this and processing it and turning it into a movement around the world. This was a very different universe for this conversation. I moved out of my home because I was being followed and threatened. I was facing personal legal threats, and I want to have that conversation about how the legal system can conspire to keep these conversations from happening. And a powerful and wealthy man said that he was going to use the best lawyers in my country to wipe out and destroy my future. I was very afraid in August of last year that I would let down so many brave women who had told their stories to me, the most difficult stories of a lifetime, and that I wouldn't be able to sleep at night knowing that I had uncovered something that was a public safety issue, and I had failed at exposing that and protecting the next woman to come along. The suffering of those women mattered, but society wasn't telling me that it mattered. People simply didn't think this was going to be a story. And I wish I could tell you that in the face of that, I was confident, that I was sure of myself, that I didn't care about the opposition, or I said, to hell with it. And if there's ever a movie version of this, I'm sure there'll be a scene in which some actor who's much better looking than me sits down and lowers his shades and says, to hell with your objections, I'm running the story. I don't know what actor this is, like Clint Eastwood or something. But the real version of this was I was heartbroken and I was scared and I had absolutely no idea if I was doing the right thing. There were so many people in my ear that I trusted, making such good arguments that what I was doing was a mistake. Not because they were necessarily evil in all cases, but because they looked at the world as it existed at the time, and they concluded, this isn't worth it. You'll tell one story, and then you won't be able to tell so many others because this is going to destroy your career. They were being rational at the time. They were looking at what our culture would accept and what it would care about based on all the evidence. And as I said, these were people I trusted. My bosses saying, you have got to stop, let it go. My agent saying, this is causing too many speed bumps for your career, let it go. Even loved ones saying, is this really worth it? Pointing out that I was going to risk everything for a story that might not even make a dent. And I seriously considered those perspectives because I felt, well, what do I know? I remember a low point last fall, September of last year, where I hadn't slept, and I had lost a lot of weight, and I was on the phone with my poor, long-suffering partner who dealt with a lot of annoying calls from me at this point in time. And I was in a cab going from one meeting with a source to another, and I had just learned that I was probably going to get scooped by another outlet and lose this story entirely, and I just fell apart completely. I was sobbing and then trying not to sob, which made it worse, and I'm pretty sure there was a lot of snot happening. It was not pretty. And I remember saying I swung too wide, and I gambled too much, and I lost everything. My partner said, okay, we're going to talk about all this, but first you were going to tip that cab driver really well. The driver's name was Omar. He was very supportive. Thank you, Omar. I didn't stop in the end because I knew I'd never be able to live with myself if I didn't honor the risks those sources had taken. But also, less nobly, I really had gambled too much, and there was just no way out but through at that point. But I did start to think maybe I had made the wrong call. And that's my point here. In hindsight, it's always easy to know whether your choices were the right ones. In hindsight, you know whether it was right to stick to your guns or right to turn the other cheek. Whether it was right to give up on a story, give a little to get along, move on. Not because you're cowardly, but because there are other stories, and there's only so much that you can do. But in the moment, you don't know any of those things. You don't know how important a story is going to be. You don't know if you're fighting because you're right, or if you're fighting because of your ego and your desire to win and your notion of yourself as a hero in your own story. Maybe your judgment is clouded. Maybe the naysayers are right. But you can have a feeling. You can have an instinct. You can have a gut reaction, a little inner voice telling you what to do. And that's important. I'm so grateful for every single person who heard that voice and listened to it, even in the chaos of the moment before you have that hindsight vision. Every person who stood up and instead of thinking of what's smart and strategic, just thought about what's right. That's certainly happened here in the Australian media. This is why it's an honor to have this conversation with Tracey. She has done that over the years, going back to when she refused to go quietly when she was fired from her network and ignited a national conversation about age and maternity discrimination in the process. Tracey, if you need someone to talk to about getting fired from your TV network. And it's a theme that runs through the stories at this conference, at this festival. You know, whether you are a provocative novelist like Irvine Welsh, who took a risk on stories about the kinds of social outcasts you don't usually hear from, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's willingly put himself in the line of fire over and over again to advance the conversation about race in America. Those are hard choices. These are stories of people who stood up and refused to let the obstacles stop them, and who let their own strong senses of principle, those little voices inside, dictate what they did, to tell them, yeah, this is important and it's worth the fight. And we need that because right now we are surrounded by a culture that tells us to instead take the easy way out, a culture that tips the scales again and again in favor of getting paid rather than protesting, that tells us to kill that story instead of poking the bear, a culture that tells us not to trust that voice. The reason that culture sends us this message is that we look around and we see people taking the easy way out. And sometimes they do get rewarded from it. You know, they do the immoral thing or the selfish thing, and it works for them. And it's easy to conclude in all of our businesses that that's just the way the world works. And probably each and every one of you, whether you're a doctor treating refugees or a financier making money off of foreclosures, and I genuinely hope you're not doing that, I am sure you have faced some version of that, a moment in your life where you had no idea what to do and where it was totally unclear to you whether this was going to be right for your community, your family, yourself. I hope that every time that happens, you look at the kinds of stories that are being told at this festival, the kind of principle that Tracey embodies, and you listen to that little voice. And you decide to do the thing that's right on principle and not listen to the whims of a culture that prizes ambition and sensationalism and celebrity and vulgarity and doing whatever it takes to win. And I'd say, particularly for any of us in that profession that Tracey and I are in, the writers, the reporters, the commentators, the people who shape the conversation, what you do is important in these coming days and months. Freedom of press isn't automatic, and as recent events in my country illustrate, the constant barrage of attacks on the press, the revival of the authoritarian mantra of fake news, it's fragile. It's a privilege that needs to be defended and constantly protected. Constantly in our work, we face incentives to take the easy path, the friendly path, the path of least resistance. And it's only by choosing again and again to take the hard path, the adversarial path, that we stand up for this precious institution that is so important to all of us around the world. All right, let's talk about some hard truths here. Tracey? Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking truth to power. Have a seat, my friend.
Let's do it.
I loved how you said this is a public safety issue because it absolutely is. Thank you for your courage, your candour, your good humour. And I was thinking as you spoke that you are the perfect antidote to a global narrative dominated by a self-confessed pussy grabber. So
we can get into that. Let's go there. I've done a fair number of stories on that guy.
Awesome. One thing I struggled with while reading about your career was whether to describe you as an activist, an advocate, or a journalist. Is there a conflict between those things or a confluence?
I think that there's both. There's certainly a natural tension I've said publicly that I don't consider myself an activist. I think the work of activists is crucial and indispensable, and good reporting can lead to good activism. But I also think it's not my job to start movements and to tell people what's right and what's wrong. The specific part of the process that I handle is just putting a spotlight on the facts and then letting other people run with it.
And yet they're incredibly hard stories to get up, as you touched on and as we've found here in Australia. When you had those problems with NBC, why wouldn't the network support your investigations? Do you believe it was a cover-up?
You'd have to ask them that, Tracey.
Now, that's a politician's answer. In your heart of hearts, do you believe it was a cover-up, or do you believe, as you once wrote, old school media's slow evolution is creating a culture of impunity and silence?
Well, I'm not going to say anything about that right now, but I would check the New York Times tomorrow for another person's perspective on that.
Read the New York Times tomorrow. I look forward to that. You told The Hollywood Reporter that these types of stories are, quote, invariably a pain in the ass for lawyers at any media company.
They're a pain in the ass for everyone, let's be honest.
Well,
that's why
expensive.
they're so important.
They're time-consuming. You get threats.
Right, you've done this yourself, you know. This is
right.
not an easy path to take for anyone involved.
Yeah. The extra problem we have in Australia is we don't have First Amendment protections. We have some of the toughest defamation laws in the world. I've found with some media organisations I've worked with, the allegations have got too close to the people in power, so they pulled out of the investigation. What can everyone in this room do to put pressure on media organisations to keep following these important stories?
Such an important topic, and I'm glad you raised the legal differences. The truth is, as I travel around the world, I do see these stark differences. So the first thing I would say is, obviously there are the extreme examples. You were wonderful to point out the work that Penn does and the kinds of journalists that are really in the line of fire, that are imprisoned or even killed for their work. I worked in Pakistan for a time when I was with the State Department. I wrote about Pakistani journalists a lot in this book, War on Peace. And I thought often as I was in that process, well, yeah, this is bad and no journalist should have to go through this, but also it's so much worse, because I had worked with all of these Pakistani reporters who are just in the line of fire. I mean, they are killed in such large numbers, it's astonishing. It's not a conversation about getting sued in those places. It's, is my body going to wash up in a canal the next day? So that's the most extreme version. But even amongst sort of developed Western countries that have a modicum of protections for the press, there's a really stark difference between the kind of investigative reporting that happens in the States and the kind that happens in Europe, or even, I gather, Australia. As much as there's good work that's happening everywhere, I feel very fortunate to be working in the United States, because we do have this extraordinary protection of the First Amendment, and it does make a vast difference. And I see it, when I do anything that's then subsequently published in, say, the UK. It's just the edges have to get sanded off because there is not the legal infrastructure to support the work. So on one level, I think everyone around the world needs to demand that they have better legal protections. And I know that's a vast fundamental change that's not going to happen overnight, but I hope people pay attention to how vital the press has been with this kind of investigative reporting in the United States. I don't think it could have happened almost anywhere else. Then, the other dimension of this is, regardless of the legal protections you do or don't have in your country, companies have to know it will be bad for them if they bury stories. And it is worth taking a risk both for the bottom line and for the conversation that it can start. And I would just keep pointing to the successful examples that illustrate that.
And people are crying out for investigative journalism in an era of fake news, don't you think?
I think so. I mean, the stories that I've done for The New Yorker have been a huge juggernaut for them in terms of numbers. This is content people want, to be just sort of crass and talk about it in terms that the companies underwriting this sort of stuff would understand. And I think it's incredibly short-sighted that a lot of companies saw the age of Twitter, particularly this is true in our business in TV, and said, okay, what the kids want is the shorter headline. They have a short attention span and they don't want deeper stories. I think actually the opposite is true. I think as the headline has become fungible, people no longer are going to go to a place to get that. They're going to just naturally get that through every device on their body. It'll be in our shoes soon. But the deeper dive, that's always going to exist, and that will still be a destination. And that's why you see, long-form storytelling. This is true of the podcast gold rush that's happening around the world right now. Things like Serial, documentaries are having a huge boom in the United States. And that's at a time when, most forms of TV journalism are contracting.
People are seeking truth and authenticity.
Yes, and depth.
Yet, and depth. As you say, we don't face the kind of challenges that reporters face in Pakistan or Afghanistan. But your initial piece on Black Cube and Kroll was fascinating. What did Weinstein and his people try to do to shut down your story?
Yes, you're right to illustrate the fact that while we're not getting killed en masse in the United States as journalists, there are instruments of real threatening and intimidating efforts. The private security firms are part of that. I think everyone was sort of surprised when I ran that first story that exposed the way that Weinstein was using these high-priced international investigation firms. Black Cube is a great example. This is founded by former Mossad agents in Israel. Its operatives are, combat trained and experienced in the battlefield. They're using front companies. They're using false identities. And I think there are correct questions being asked now about whether we should call that legitimate private investigation or whether there is an element of fraud in that should be policed more closely.
And here's where the Hollywood Me Too stories intersect with politics. On the plane this morning, I read your most recent piece on Black Cube and the so-called echo chamber memo circulated throughout the Trump administration. If you could take the audience through, in layperson's terms, what is happening there, because it's quite frightening.
Well, we have an administration right now that indulges in a lot of conspiracy theories. And this was one that circulated on Breitbart and other conservative websites in 2016 and 17. And basically the idea was that former Obama administration officials were running a secret war room where there were operations officers and a really, an organized structure, and it was bankrolled by wealthy parties on the Democratic side of the aisle, and that they were doing sort of black ops against the Trump administration and planting stories and manipulating the press. And they used a term that was used by an Obama foreign policy advisor, Ben Rhodes. He had said that there was an echo chamber that they created when they were advocating for the Iran deal. And so this then became inflated into this vast mythic idea that the Trump administration had, that there was this secret war room. And what's fascinating is that my colleague Adam Entus and I at The New Yorker uncovered this memo that was circulated at very high levels of the Trump White House, giving life to these fantasies and looking at them from a military analysis standpoint, like really treating these Obama guys as enemy combatants. So a lot of people found that quite a troubling use of the National Security Council's time. Tracey?
It's a boom. It's an understatement. It's a boom time for conspiracy theories. For your extraordinary piece on Weinstein, and I do want to dig deep on your investigation at the moment, you spoke to more than 300 people over 10 to 12 months. How hard was it to get women to go on the record, particularly if they had confidentiality agreements?
You've dealt with this too. It's incredibly hard. These are really, really tough stories to relive. It's re-traumatizing, it's triggering. People are often up against extremely litigious, powerful men. That's often what's kept these stories silent for so long in the first place. So you're asking them to expose themselves to all of this legal risk, to go through the kind of branding that any survivor of sexual assault goes through when they come forward publicly, whether it's in your community or on the world stage. You have to pose the question of, do I want this to be the first thing that comes up when someone Googles me, when I walk into my local supermarket, I had that conversation countless times with the women in the Weinstein story, what are people going to think when I walk into a room after this? So there's that aspect which I think every survivor of sexual violence goes through. And then there's the additional weight of knowing there's this vast PR machine, legal machine, private investigation effort that will all be directed at you. And the good news is, when I started these conversations around the Weinstein story, it was really hard to convey to these sources that there was a universe in which they could do this and it wouldn't destroy their lives and they would actually be heard and it could help some other people. There just weren't enough precedents to talk about. So I had to kind of cobble together and say, hey, look at the women who talked about Bill Cosby, and look at what Gretchen Carlson, this American reporter, did in coming forward about harassment at Fox News. But there wasn't a lot of precedent. And now I think it's much clearer to people that they can speak and they can come forward and they will be heard, and that there will be a lot of protections for them. Because by and large, the women who spoke out about Harvey Weinstein have found it, I think, pretty fulfilling and have not lost their careers over it and have not been sued.
Well, thank you for providing that precedent, because that made it an awful lot easier for journalists in Australia to say, look, the people in America found this cathartic, they found it empowering. That's the response that's come to me from most of the women who've disclosed. I've also developed a bit of a theory that we're on a process where the shame, fear and guilt felt by survivors of sexual assault has been transferred to the perpetrators and the protectors. How far along that spectrum do you think we are?
I think there's a long way to go still. I think, this is still an incredibly hard process for people to go through, but we are now, as a culture, starting to reward people speaking the truth, and that's correct, I think. This is, the public safety framing is one I go back to a lot. This is an opportunity for each and every person who has experienced potentially the MO of a serial predator to protect the next person who comes along. And that's really important, and it's important that we create incentives that encourage people to come forward in those cases.
Definitely. There's a real double-edged sword, though, about the anonymity of social media. I know a lot of people contacted you and contacted me because we made ourselves available on social media. I know a lot of people have talked about their alleged offenders on social media because they don't want to go through the investigative journalism or the court or police path. Do you have some sympathy or empathy, I guess, for people who name someone on social media because they feel they have nowhere else to turn?
I have empathy, but at the same time, I don't know that that's the most powerful way to do it, or the fairest way to do it. I've said repeatedly, my mantra isn't, believe survivors. It's listen to survivors. I think these are stories that simply weren't being heard for too long. But I still think it's important to interrogate each story. And I tell this to sources. It's a hard conversation to have, The most powerful role I can play is not automatically believing you. It's listening to you and taking you seriously, and then being almost adversarial in really running down every potential source of corroboration and stress testing every potential weakness in the story. And at the end of a process like that, you have a story that the public can rely on with a certain level of trust, and that is fair to the subject of the accusation, and that maybe also then triggers whatever the appropriate civil or criminal legal repercussions would be. And I think it's much harder to have that effect if you are just taking to social media and getting it out. Now, there are a lot of different contexts for this. I certainly know people who, have allegations against someone who's not necessarily public, and they just want to get that off of their chest, and that's part of a healing process. And I would never say that someone shouldn't do that, but I think that's very different from the kind of investigation that I engage in.
What do you say to people who say, why should a survivor go to an investigative journalist? Why not just go to the police?
I think they should go to the police. I mean, these are stories where people were too frightened for years and years to go to the police, and by and large, I'm dealing with cases where they've either exhausted all of their criminal opportunities for justice, or the statute of limitations has run and it's now too late for them to do that. I think that if you are within the statute of limitations and you can go to the authorities and you want justice, you should do that. On the other hand, certainly in the States, we have a criminal justice system that very often lets down survivors of sexual violence and treats them pretty badly and exposes them to a pretty traumatic process that doesn't always result in anything. And I understand why those people sometimes are too afraid to subject themselves to that, knowing how broken the system is, or try to go through that and fail to get the results they want, and then say, okay, I'm going to talk to a reporter. So I think these two things can actually work together.
I think you're right. It's very traumatic and re-traumatising and triggering, as you say, for women to continually have to share their stories. And there should be a better way. I know you're a journalist, not an activist, but what kind of changes are happening, or would you like to see happen in the United States with regards to legislation, policy, procedures, or culture?
Well, we're seeing some promising changes in, for instance, the way non-disclosure agreements are handled in the United States. A number of states since this past fall have changed the rules so that you can't have non-disclosure agreements about certain types of violent sexual crimes. You have a number of states who have also taken a look at statute of limitations issues and waived the statute of limitations for the most serious kinds of violent sexual crimes. Those are all steps in the right direction that I hope we see around the world.
Yeah, that's something we're looking at changing here as well. Then you've got to look at the enablers and protectors like those who surrounded Harvey Weinstein. How can advocates convince organisations in any sector that money spinners who are sexual harassers and abusers are sooner or later going to become financial burdens? So I've got a bit of a theory that the economic cost will become so great for companies that they'll have to do something about this.
It is ultimately about the bottom line. I mean, I haven't done that many Me Too stories. I did the whole cycle of Weinstein stories over the course of several months, and then I did do one story about the New York Attorney General who was committing violent crimes against women, and then I, for many months, worked on this story about the CEO of CBS, one of our major networks in the United States. And the reason I chose that story was it was very clear that this was an alleged serial predator. I mean, there were a lot of allegations, and they were from very credible, serious women, and he subsequently admitted to a fair amount of it, actually. But what made that an important story in my mind is he was one of the biggest, I mean, you used the term money spinners, he was one of the biggest heavyweights in Hollywood, probably the most powerful and profitable person in American television, makes, 70 million American dollars a year. And is viewed as being indispensable to the fortunes of the shareholders of that company. So I thought it would be an interesting and sort of extreme litmus test for, all right, all of you who have been principled about, say, throwing Harvey Weinstein under the bus because he's a guy who's in decline and no one was making that much money off. What do you say when it's someone who really affects the bottom line? And the answer is there's a lot more reluctance to confront hard truths. And I don't know how you change that, except that consumers need to, really align their sense of principle with their decisions about what they watch and what they buy.
Are you disappointed with the lack of action on Moonfez? Because your story on him was just horrific.
It's not so much my job to be disappointed one way or the other. I can tell you a lot of the sources in that story are disappointed. And I certainly thought that it was part of what made that story important, that the industry would have to deal with this decision of whether they swept it under the rug. And you see exactly how that's unfolded.
We now know that a prominent law firm that used to represent Harvey Weinstein handed over a $25,000 cheque, you touched on this earlier, to Governor Andrew Cuomo's campaign 6 days before the governor called off a probe into the handling of the sexual misconduct allegations. Coincidence or not?
I reported over and over again on how a lot of corruption within the criminal justice system allowed these allegations to stay quiet for so long. There's a crazy connection between what Harvey Weinstein did with the private investigation firms and then decisions that were made in the New York DA's office not to charge him, decisions that were being made by people who were getting a lot of calls from private investigators who were hired specifically because they had just left that office, they had just been employed as colleagues of the people who were making the decision to charge him or not. I mean, this is an illustration of how if you are wealthy enough, you can really subvert and distort the justice process in the States.
So do you think people like Harvey Weinstein will ever be convicted in a traditional sense?
I mean, the Harvey Weinstein story became such a symbol of so many cases where no justice had happened for years and years, and there had been impunity for a powerful person, that I think it's now a little bit of an idiosyncratic case. I think that people will try to probably handle it in a more forthright way than is the norm. What I'm more concerned about is, does that translate into reform for so many other cases that, you know, all of these instruments that are supposed to serve justice encounter. You know, women are coming to the authorities every day with these kinds of stories, and I don't think they're seeing the same kind of righteous process that now we're seeing in the Weinstein case.
We're talking a lot about Hollywood and privileged white women, and I know it's important. These examples are really powerful. And I also know that a lot of your work in the past has focused on anonymous survivors of abuse in refugee camps and conflict zones. What do you say to people who say this is just a movement for the privileged and it's not going to trickle down to the people who really do experience it at a higher rate and suffer the most?
I'm really glad you asked about that, because it's striking how little that comes up in conversations that I have. Most people have forgotten that the first work I did was about sexual violence in Sudan, and talking to, you know, women in Darfur who had been raped, and where that was, you know, a real systemic tool for oppression. And those articles that I was writing at the time, many of them for the Wall Street Journal, were very much cousins of the later reporting I did about Weinstein. I mean, this is the same issue. This has terrorized so many people around the world for so long. And in both cases, you're dealing with systems that prevent women from speaking up and render them powerless. So I hope people see the sort of epicenter of this in Hollywood as a starting point, not an end, and realize that it has to then be extended to conversations in all of our industries. I mean, this is just as hard for the, you know, worker on an assembly line who is speaking out against her or his shift manager.
And yet when I've tried to pitch stories like that to media organisations in Australia, they're nowhere near as interested because it doesn't involve the celebrity factor.
Yep.
How do we pitch these stories so they're on the front page of the New Yorker?
I wish I had a great answer to that. You know, it's much harder. Thankfully, there's been great reporting along these lines in the States. You know, the New York Times did a great article about farm workers. There's been great reporting on domestic workers, but not enough of it. And it's always going to be a harder pitch. I think, you know, you can still have cases where stories break through. A couple of years ago, there was a wonderful expose in the New York Times about the conditions that nail salon workers live with. And, you know, that just the power of good storytelling caused that to kind of go viral. And it's something that resonated with so many women, especially because they go to salons and they know what it's like to look across at that usually poor, usually immigrant worker, and then they had a window into these women's lives and how terrible they could be. So you have to be creative as a reporter and a storyteller in finding those points of commonality and of relatability, and just trying to pick stories that, even if they don't have that kind of sexy, you know, marquee name component, have something else that gives them life.
That's somewhere the Me Too movement really needs to go. But I'm starting to wonder whether we're at a moment of such backlash that we might actually go backwards when Louis C.K. goes on stage and gets a standing ovation and doesn't address any of the issues in his routine. How long should a perpetrator be punished for? I mean, it's been 8 to 10 months since the story about Louis C.K. came out. Should he have gone on stage to a standing ovation in the last 48 hours?
You know, it's not for me to moralize or prognosticate about when people should or shouldn't come back after an allegation. I think this is so case by case. You know, I do think that there's a fair amount of kind of lazy conflating of different types of criminal activity and non-criminal but inappropriate activity. You have to be really careful to have meticulous, thorough reporting about each of these things individually, Louis C.K. is not Harvey Weinstein. I'm not saying that what Louis C.K. did was acceptable by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not saying necessarily that Louis C.K. should come back immediately or that he doesn't need to address this when he does go on stage. But I am saying that it's case by case. And, at the same time, as I would say all those things I just said, I wouldn't necessarily be the one to stand up and say absolutely definitively Louis C.K. shouldn't be doing stand-up. I haven't investigated that case. I don't know the specifics enough, and ultimately for some of the less serious kinds of offenses that have emerged in this conversation, I think you do want to have a conversation about, okay, if someone has apologized and there's not a criminal component to what they did in place, and they've fully kind of grappled with the ramifications of what they've done, what's the way back?
One of the other stories you did was on New York Attorney General, Weinstein critic and defender of women's rights, Eric Schneiderman, who resigned hours after your story on him was published. Are you concerned that many men are staying quiet about Me Too because they fear inviting scrutiny of their own behaviour?
I don't see why they would. I mean, hopefully your first line of defense on this is to just not harass or assault people.
Good advice.
Right. I mean, whether you're defending good causes or not is kind of irrelevant. The point is just behave well.
Yeah, just don't assault women.
Right.
What about men like Dan?
Good simple rules we're coming up with here tonight.
Exactly. Sometimes they're the best. What about men like Dan Harmon, who created the series Community? He was really proactive in making a public confession before it was outed. I mean, you're seeing a lot of men doing that, getting on the front foot and going, gee, I've done some pretty crap stuff in the past and I'm sorry for that.
Well, this is like the Louis C.K. case. I haven't reported on this in detail. I have only the most glancing knowledge of that case. I think I heard a few sound bites from that. I guess he did it on a podcast, some sort of long soul-searching, where it seemed like he was quite deeply thinking about the way he treated a woman on his writing staff. I would be careful, because I don't know that case, to not defend him on that, because I don't know the specifics, and I certainly wouldn't want to, undermine whatever allegation that woman came forward with. But I do think in principle, when people, again, mostly when we're talking about the non-criminal category of behavior, which is what I understand is the case in this story, when people have a forthright conversation about what was wrong and what made people feel uncomfortable and how they've modified their behavior, I think that's a promising part of the conversation that we should encourage.
I've been taking up so much of your time. We are going to open this to audience questions in about 7 minutes, so please have a think about what questions you've got. We'll have half an hour for questions, and please come to the microphones on either side of the room very shortly.
Teach me how to pronounce Melbourne. Yeah?
I reckon that's about 10 out of 10 right there. Is there anything you cannot do?
Setting the bar pretty low if that's what we're impressed with.
Oh, no, you are super impressive all round, pronunciation included. We often talk about women who are survivors of sexual assault. We've been talking about that a lot tonight. And they are the overwhelming majority, but around 5% of the people who've disclosed to me are men. Sometimes the offenders are men, sometimes the offenders are women. I know you don't want to talk about the Asia Argento case, but she's being accused of being a hypocrite for speaking out about her experiences about Harvey Weinstein. She played a really prominent role in that extraordinary story you did. At the same time, paying hush money to a former child actor, James Bennett. Does this cause problems for the Me Too movement, a story like this?
I think everyone rational who's responded to that allegation has correctly said how serious it is if it's true, and also how it absolutely doesn't undermine these important allegations that keep coming forward. Harvey Weinstein was accused of sexual assault and harassment by dozens and dozens of women, including in that story. This idea that misconduct by victims somehow also invalidates an entire conversation about sexual assault and harassment is not one that I take particularly seriously. Obviously, victims can also be perpetrators. And in all of these cases, the question should be, do the claims check out? So, I would hope that anytime any accuser is in turn accused of doing something very, very serious themselves, that the same threshold is used of, is there a careful investigation here happening as to what happened? That's what we should be looking for in all these cases. And this straw man argument of, anytime any woman does something wrong, it invalidates a whole conversation about numerous criminal charges against numerous people. I don't see a lot of people actually taking that seriously.
I think it's a straw man argument as well. Because you do dig so deep, I'm worried about the impact it has on you. I have had a small taste of what you've gone through, and certainly the people who suffer the most are the survivors of sexual assault, but there is vicarious trauma. How have you managed that?
Thank you. She's so nice.
I'm worried about you. It makes me sound like I'm your mother. I'm worried about you.
I've heard you talk for a few minutes now. You doing okay? Well, in my defense, it is 4 a.m. or something back home. So I'm a little bit jet-lagged. First of all, I'm tired all the time, which is a good place to be. I mean, these are champagne problems. Like, I have all these leads coming in. I'm so grateful to every source who speaks up about, not just the sexual violence issues, but any of these tough stories, the political stories. So, as long as I'm in that very fortunate position where I'm fielding a lot of incoming information, I want to do as much justice to that as I can. So my sensation of it is really much more working around the clock. It is true that, as you alluded to, on the sexual violence stories in particular, and stories about violent crime in general, if you live in that space psychologically for months and months and months, it takes a toll. There are times where you're sort of, obviously you're a professional as you're dealing with it, and part of that is sort of not letting it in emotionally, but there are times where you just sort of get filled up with trauma and pain, and it can feel quite overwhelming.
I'm also worried because every time you do stories like this, it must bring back a lot of things that are closer to home. For example, that extraordinary piece you wrote in support of your sister Dylan. I know you don't want to go too deep on family issues, and I completely respect that decision. But what really stood out to me was when you wrote that piece, it was incredibly powerful because a lot of people believed you because you were a man. A lot of people who didn't believe Dylan. Is that why you wrote it?
It's interesting. I mean, I think I, like so many people of all genders, went through a process of not wanting to confront this, not wanting to deal with it, and then finally realizing, okay, in cases where there is a real preponderance of evidence in favor of a claim of this kind, you have to confront it, as painful as it may be. So that story was a bit of a microcosm, I think, for the larger conversation that we've had.
And a story that you had to write by the sound of it.
Yeah, I mean, she was pissed off that I hadn't. and rightly so, and she's an incredibly brave, tough person, and in the end, as much as it's an incredibly unpleasant thing every time that comes out in the press, and anyone who's had this issue in their family would, I'm sure, agree with this, I have to be proud of her for putting us all in that inconvenient situation.
Does it also piss you off that people continue to stand by Woody Allen despite everything that you've done and said and that Dylan's done and said?
That too is sort of beyond the purview of what I do and even what I've written about in that case. I felt it was appropriate for me after a review of the evidence to say, yeah, the facts are really on her side and are pretty damning, and that does meet a threshold where I think reporters should ask tough questions about it. Beyond that, you'd have to ask her. I think she probably is much more invested in this question of, do people support sexual predators? Do they work with them? That I think is very personal for her.
I've heard it said that Donald Trump, yes, we're getting to Donald Trump now, is everything
Oh,
that...
joy.
Woo! Is everything that you abhor. However, every movement attempting long-term global social change needs a powerful enemy. Does his sheer existence mean that momentum will continue for the Me Too movement?
You know, I travel all the way across the world to get away from American politics. Here it is, staring me in the face. Can't we talk about Australian politics a little bit? Do you guys even, as Australians, understand Australian politics enough to talk about it? Because I do not.
How long have we got?
Right. I mean, I'm sure only like 10, 15 minutes until you have a new prime minister, right?
That's right.
That's kind of the pace
Might have
at
happened
which-
by now.
Unbelievable. I will say that it has come up in various strands of the reporting that I do. This theme of just frustration that there wasn't any kind of accountability after a man of Donald Trump's profile said things like he said in that Access Hollywood tape, and that has motivated some people to speak out.
You're writing a book at the moment called Catch and Kill. Your stories about the National Enquirer paying a fortune to effectively kill stories about Donald Trump's affairs are compelling. How many more of those have you got coming out?
Can't talk about stories that I haven't published.
Damn it!
You're a damn good reporter, Tracey, but you won't get it out of me.
I gave it a crack, brother. I gave it a crack. Is it true that you'll also be publishing a story?
She tried to wind me up backstage, by the way. You know,
I did.
Have a drink. Tell me about stories you haven't run yet.
I tried to get him drunk. I tried to use the off-the-record trick. None of it works. He's absolutely slick. Is it true that you'll soon be publishing a story alleging Republican operative Roger Stone briefed President Trump on WikiLeaks plans to post the hacked Democrats' emails?
You know the answer to this, Tracey.
Oh, damn it! Wouldn't be any kind of journalist if I didn't try. Something else you're probably not going to answer. If you went into politics in a post-Trump world, what would you do differently?
I don't know that I would go into politics.
Would you rule it out?
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of yeah, or really yeah?
Really, yeah. First of all, I don't think anyone wants me in politics. Second of all, as much as I'm flattered that people occasionally ask me that question, I think that it takes souls of perhaps greater fortitude than I have to subject themselves to the broken, money-flooded political system as it exists in the United States right now. It's an inhospitable environment to people of principle who don't want to be beholden to special interests, and I would hope I'm in that category. We need good people to break through that and go into politics in the States, but I don't know if that's the place I can be most effective.
Well, I, for one, am glad that you're going to be continuing to speak truth to power. My final question, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience, is what's your own relationship with power?
That's really interesting. You know, I've gotten this question a couple of times. I certainly have tried to be clear-eyed throughout my life about privilege that I have. And I think that anytime you have privilege or power, it raises the stakes in terms of your ethical responsibility to try to give back and to be hyper attentive to the situations of people who don't have that privilege or power. And that includes both people around you who are affected by you, and also people in the broader world who maybe aren't seen or heard because they don't have that platform. So a lot of my work is animated by that idea that, like, all right, if you're starting from the position that you are fortunate enough to have some kind of profile, and this is true of you too, how do you use it to elevate some of those voices that we don't hear from all of the time?
Well, thank you for using your power for good, not evil. Please thank
you.
Ronan Farrow.
Thank you, guys.
And please come up and ask him questions. We have about 24 and a bit minutes. Now, I can't see because of the lights.
I may fall asleep on stage by the end of this.
If you hear a gentle snoring, you'll know what it is. Now, who is up there at the mic? I can't even see the microphones. Where are the microphones? Aha, there they are. Thank you very much. I think we'll take a question from this side. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Farrow, I was curious to know about what your experience has been in how you relate to pieces of art and...
Wait, where are you?
Over here.
Okay, I see you.
Hi.
Thank you, that helped.
So, interested in perhaps over the course of your lifetime as well as through this recent experience, how have you related or navigated what it's like finding out these terrible things about people that have also created what is considered great art or other pieces of great work and achievement that people have a relationship with and that draw inspiration and strength from? A tangible example that comes to mind for me is the comedy of Louis C.K., for example. I mean, how do you relate to these things after these things have come out about the creators?
You know, I get this question a lot, and I have seen the great proliferation of think pieces about this subject, and I don't at all mean to diminish your thoughtful grappling with it by saying that, oddly, I have not lost any sleep about this and care about it very little. I'm not saying it's inappropriate for you to care about it or for anyone else to. I just don't find it to be high on my list of problems. I view them as separate issues. I've never really been someone who's demanded boycotts. Again, this is where my view of the issue isn't so much activist as it is journalistic.
Do you think boycotts don't work, or it's just not necessarily your thing?
It's just not necessarily my thing. I think it's totally appropriate and even a wonderful thing in some cases where people then go on and there is an activist movement that results in a boycott of someone's work. That can be fine. But I feel like my job in this, and maybe this is where I'm able to insulate myself a little bit from this particular question, my job is just, all right, if there is a serious and potentially criminal allegation, and it's worthy of coverage, can we do that in a careful way? And to me, that doesn't conflict at all or even interact with these questions of artistic legacy. I personally, I'm trying to think of the example that would resonate with me personally. I certainly I like Louis C.K.'s work before the allegations against him. I still love a few of the Roman Polanski movies. And I would say probably it does, as a consumer, affect my decisions. I don't know that I would, run around publicly supporting Roman Polanski, for instance. He's a good example because obviously that's a really serious set of crimes that we're talking about. But I also don't particularly lose sleep about, am I going to watch a few minutes of Chinatown if it comes on TV and, he's not making money off of it and I'm not sort of whitewashing his crimes by enjoying that movie. I don't have a problem with that. And the same would be even more true of the Louis C.K. example, where it's a significantly less serious set of allegations. Again, not to at all lessen what those women went through, but I just view it as a totally separate question, this question of artistic merit. And one of the pivotal implications of that is I don't think in any case that we should be more reluctant to talk about serious criminal activity because someone is, a quote-unquote great artist.
Great question. Thank you so much. We have one over here now.
Thank you very much for coming to Melbourne.
Melbourne. Thank you. This is a very warm and supportive environment for me.
My question is about generational change. And I think what's interesting, I'm 64, and when I think about the people that I knew who had sexual assault in their 20s, so that would be the 70s and the 80s, I wonder, and I don't see a great deal of difference now. What I see is it's more public. What is it we need to do, and it's a question probably to both of you, to really embed change in the next generation of particularly gender equality, so that we really can move forward rather than constantly be thinking about what the problems are, of which there are many, but what are the solutions to moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. The solutions are in all of your hands. I mean, I think just the fact that we're having these conversations in a way that we didn't a few years ago is a really encouraging sign. I think that in and of itself is part of the solution. And then I think some of the policy changes that we talked about earlier, that's part of the solution going forward. And I think that as much as some of the issues we've talked about tonight can be painful to confront, we are on our way to a better place. We still have a long way to go, but I think the conversation is much more humane and much fairer than it's been in the past. So in the end, your question is exactly the right framing, and my answer is that I am somewhat optimistic in spite of how dark all of this is.
I'd like to thank you for asking that question as a second-wave feminist, because we stand here on the shoulders of giants for the advances that the women before us made. So thank you. Yeah, how about a round of applause for the suffragettes and the second and third-wave feminists? Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. I'd also like to say that Marieke Hardy has put on this amazing festival with a real tone of kindness, love and support. And younger women, when they're speaking out, we need to support them rather than saying, why didn't you fight him off? Why did you not talk about it at the time? Why didn't you go to the police? So my advice to everyone here, and I'm sure you do, is, you know, support women when they speak out rather than asking what they should have done.
Yeah, hi, Les from Melbourne. I'd like to know what we should conclude about American society when we understand that Bill Clinton, who has an appalling track record in relation to women for a very, very long period of time, and we understand that when he left the White House, he was thoroughly bankrupted on the back of all the settlements with those women. What does it say about American society that he remains very, very popular?
I actually think that there's been a radical reassessment of Bill Clinton's legacy that's very apparent in any of the public discourse about him. I don't think people have just left that issue unexamined. I think there's a lot of condemnation about Bill Clinton out there, and a lot of questions are correctly being raised about those allegations against him. And probably the next step in that is exactly what we've seen in some of these other cases where there's been some sort of ideally criminal and failing that at least journalistic resolution. People should do thorough investigations into each of those allegations.
Definitely, although there is a political aspect to this that we haven't spoken about in this conversation, so thank you for bringing that up. A lot of people have come forward to me about members of, say, the National Party or the Labor Party or the Liberal Party in Australia. It's been very hard to get them to go on the record because they're members of that party and they believe in the greater good. They don't want to speak out against that person who is usually a serial offender. So that wedded to a political party thing is really problematic when you're trying to get people to go on the record. Have you found that at all?
Yes, the political power is one of the forces that can cloak these allegations for so long. Certainly Harvey Weinstein used his status as a powerful Democratic fundraiser in the United States to shield himself and had a lot of political protectors. We're talking about power and the abuse of power, and that can be political power in a lot of cases.
Exactly. Another question over here.
Hi, I'm actually from the US and have seen how social media has had a very insidious effect on our politics, where fake news, and you could certainly expand this to the world, has spread and sparked a lot of conspiracy theories. You spoke for journalists and around the world that there should be a push to make platforms more open for people to speak so that old media can't kill stories. What's the right balance for teaching people to speak more and openly when social media and the platforms that enable them to do so take away the rules that traditional journalism inspires people to abide with?
It's a great question, and it's one that America is grappling with right now. You need social media companies to step up and set up a modicum of protection of the conversation, and that is always going to be a thorny, difficult conversation to have because you don't want to be on the wrong side of this often fuzzy line between protection and censorship. And I think there are encouraging signs that after a lot of difficult back and forth, some of these companies are finding equilibrium. They're actually enforcing in a way they didn't in the past. Sections of their terms of use agreements that ban, hate speech and violent threats. And in some cases, you're seeing companies like Twitter obviously ban sort of conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones that are inciting violence in some cases. I think that's all encouraging, and you got to see more of that. And then you have to watch really carefully to make sure that that doesn't tilt into censorship. And the honest answer is there is no easy solution on that. I do think that the ongoing conversation about the flows of money that have created some of those pernicious forces on social media and that continue to fuel the creation of actual fake made-up news for political gain, that can help if we can root out some of the big, powerful special interests that are attempting to manipulate that world. That will also help to bring some calm in that area. But right now it's in chaos. It just is.
Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you.
Who else would like to ask a question? Do we have anyone on either side? Aha, thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, was there a sort of trigger point when you were doing the Weinstein investigation where you suddenly started to get more momentum and support from people like your agent, your friends, those sort of powerful forces you spoke about before?
No. No, I mean, I had to leave my agency, and those people are no longer my friends. So, yeah, certainly there are plenty of people who did absolutely nothing to support the reporting and have subsequently been very supportive, now that it's a celebrated, accepted thing, and that's nice. Thank you to those people.
And you talk to the hand?
It's fine. Look, I'm grateful for all the support that I get, and not everyone can kind of be courageous in the moment and stand up when it's the right thing. But no, for the people who really it was their job to stand up and support that reporting, they didn't at any point.
And one over here. Thank you.
We've talked a lot about individuals and some of the abhorrent things that they've done, and reflected a little bit on the institutions that supported them. We've had a Royal Commission in Australia into sexual assault by individuals in institutions. And there's a real concern, I think, that things will move on and those institutions will remain the same. I'm wondering how we keep the pressure up to make sure institutions change and they don't protect these perpetrators.
That's a hugely important point, and it's just one that we have to all be vigilant about. I mean, it's often the easy way out to just shuffle someone off to the side and then keep the systems in place. And what we really need is a deep reassessment of corporate or other institutional culture. When you have a company that is systematically using non-disclosure agreements to pay off women with sexual harassment allegations, rather than changing the system so that guys aren't promoted after they have a string of those allegations against them that are credible within the company, that's a problem. And we need to empower HR departments. We need to make sure problems are addressed early and systemically, and that there aren't these Band-Aid solutions that ultimately allow a culture to fester.
Do you know what? I'm a glass half full kind of person like you are, especially when I talk to board members and executives who are asking, what can we do to change this? Because our houses are threatened, our cars are threatened, and it's threatening the bottom line. So I really do believe we're living through a transformative power shift in society globally, and that's tremendously exciting.
It is. It's exciting, but the gentleman who asked the question is exactly right. A lot of the time, I think steps are taken that are skin deep, And all of us in the media need to stay on the story for that reason.
Definitely, so they don't slip back into the old habits. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nell Butler. I'm a survivor of state care here in Victoria. As the gentleman said before, we just had a Royal Commission. 41% of the testimony at the of reports of abuse at the Royal Commission happened in the care of child protection. There seems to have been an unwillingness on the part of the media to report about abuse by the state governments. The reporting of the Royal Commission was dominated by reporting about the Catholic Church, which absolutely needed to be said. But the 41% of us who were abused by state governments haven't really been heard. What can we do to convince the media and reporters to listen to us and cover our stories?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. I always am so grateful when someone stands up and talks about something really difficult. I mean, Tracey, you may have more insight into the specific landscape of what's happening in Australia. I know we have similar problems in the United States. I would hope that there are tough investigative journalists who are willing to take on this particular story. Is that the case?
There are, but we had a bit of a conversation about this in the green room before. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your experiences. In Australia, we have a very small media with very concentrated ownership. Investigative journalism is expensive, so there's very little of it done in this country, to be honest. My advice to you is to use people power. Contact the media organisations, contact the individual journalists and say, I have a story for you, I'm willing to go on the record, I know other people who are willing to go on the record. Join together and bring the story to them as much as you can, and that will get past that barrier of a lack of resources within the media department, because, you know, there is an interest and a passion to tell these stories, but the resources are really thin because of the fragmentation of the mass media, I'm sorry to say.
You have to, if you have a story that you're banging your head against the wall trying to make it heard, you have to appeal to the sort of basest instincts of the outlets that you're reaching out to. What Tracey just said is exactly right and is the smart solution. If you can sort of line up your ducks as much as possible, get people together. You know, if it's a story about serial abuse of some kind, you get as many sources together as possible so that you can say, hey, there are all these people you can talk to. You know how to do a good elevator pitch. That's true in so many contexts in life, but it's true here too. If you have a story that you feel isn't breaking through and you're approaching journalists about it, highlight the ways in which it has national significance and is going to make a big splash and is a story worth telling. And for something that is so painful and personal and clearly important, one hates to ever talk about it in those kinds of pragmatic terms, but if you're in the kind of bind you're talking about and not being heard, that would be my advice.
It's really wise advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have 6 more minutes, so please, a couple more questions. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm almost fainting with excitement up here, I have to tell you. I feel very privileged to be sitting here. Thank you very much.
I wanted you to just mention the influence of your mother on your work and what you're going to do in the future.
Thank you. I'll applaud for my mom. My mom is great. Can we give a hand to all the moms in the room? Thank you, moms. So much of the conversation that we're having about all these tough issues, corruption, the abuse of power, sexual violence, it all hinges on moms raising their kids right, You need to create a culture, and this gets to the point about intergenerational activism. You need to be raising the next generation in a way where they are better and more respectful and more candid about these issues and passing on all of the best things we can pull from this conversation in this difficult moment. And I feel really fortunate to have had a really brave, strong, working single mom who imparted a lot of really strong instincts to me. You know, I don't say that I always live up to those, but she had a wonderful sense of public service, and that was really, you know, the lifeblood of our family when I was growing up.
It's a really lovely message to take away from tonight. You know, talk to your children. They can't be too young to talk about gender inequality. We've been talking to our kids since they were really young, like 4 and 5, about this stuff. They're now 12 and 13. To my horror, my teenage son is now rebelling by debating me on feminism every night in the lounge room. So I'm not so happy about that. But the messages do sink in over time.
And for raising sons in particular, I mean, I think it was such a huge boon for me that I was raised by a really strong mother with 7 sisters. You know, I had really strong female role models around me. Also, I know what it's like to be in a house with 7 women, so that's not always a cakewalk either. But it was a wonderful influence on who I am, you know, that I had all these, you know, strong women around. And you know, I think for moms who confront these issues in a forthright way with their sons, you can wind up with a next generation of guys who aren't afraid to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and that's very exciting and powerful.
Yeah, and aren't afraid to defend and stand up for women.
Yeah. I think this might have to be the last question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your insights and all the work that you do. I'm just wondering what you're most hopeful about, most passionate about, and what fills your bucket? What allows you to restore yourself? What do you do? What are you passionate about?
So that's a pretty broad question. I think what fills my bucket, I like that image.
That's awesome.
What sort of restores my soul is, you know, every time I'm in one of these stories and someone decides to go on the record, or a secondary source decides to stand up for one of the people telling a story. Again, you know, this doesn't just go for the sexual violence stories. This is true in the political stories too. Anytime someone says, you know, oh yeah, I was there for that conversation and I'm totally going to talk about it because this is a difficult, important issue and anyone coming forward on it needs my support, it's just like, it's such a relief to me because I spend so many of my days, understandably, because we're asking a lot of sources when we report these stories. But I spend so much time just being crushingly disappointed when, you know, that guy who witnessed something just, you know, won't go on the record about it, won't talk about it, won't support the, you know, victim if it's a story about a criminal activity. And I'm just like, come on, you know, stand up. You got a chance to do something incredible here. And ultimately, you'll be richly rewarded. It will be a fulfilling thing. But it's so hard to convey to people that that's the case. And so often people take the path of least resistance and they just, you know, they don't want to get involved. So what fills my bucket is every time someone does the right thing and helps with one of these stories, I'm just like, I want to stand up and cheer. And there's a gender component to this too, because very often I find, you know, women intuitively understand, particularly on the sexual violence stories, you know, they get what the accusers are going through when they come forward, and they therefore feel more of an imperative to speak in their support. And very often I end up with this stark imbalance of these guys saying, like, I don't want to deal with this, I don't want to be anywhere near it, and me being incredibly frustrated. So I'm particularly bucket-filled when there's a guy who says, like, oh yeah, absolutely, you know, that woman I had a conversation with 20 years ago about this, like, I'll totally support her because I have daughters and I want to do the right thing here. So everyone who has the opportunity, if you ever have the chance to, whether it's like in your own personal life and someone is going to the authorities, or they're just coming to you and they've mentioned something difficult, or a reporter comes to you and asks, hey, would you support someone who's saying a thing? Like, just leap at that opportunity, please, please, for the sake of victims everywhere and sources in difficult situations everywhere and tired reporters everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's funny. I've got the same bucket-filling moment. For my sins, I live in Tony Abbott's electorate. Now, Tony Abbott you probably don't know is an arch conservative in Australia, and I usually go to weekend barbecues and get ribbed. People joke about, what are you up to, you feminist rat bag? And in the last couple of months, I've had men in their 50s and 60s come up to me and say, thank you for what you and the other women are doing for our daughters and granddaughters.
Good,
and that's where we know that cultural change is actually happening, and that's where we know it will stick for the long term.
Also, you need a T-shirt that says feminist rat bag, and I would like to wear one too.
I'm so going to get those made for us. Would you please thank Ronan Farrow?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being such a wonderful crowd. Thank you for the smart questions. Thank you, Tracey.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.